came mostly for the title of the presentation, which is pro tips for using Spring in your application. And I will provide you the tips one by one. And for most of them, we'll always try to do some coding to show you precisely what I mean when I say, for example, tip 1, beans. Define as beans only objects that need to be defined as beans. Most of the tips that I wrapped here in our presentation are common mistakes. Not necessarily, the tips are not the mistakes. The tips are helping you avoiding the mistakes, but they are put by me in the presentation to help you avoid common mistakes that happen when implementing applications with Spring. Common mistakes I've seen a lot in the applications I'm developing, in the application I've been developing, in the applications I'm doing consultancy for, and you will reading this, keeping them in mind, you make sure you don't repeat those mistakes, and by avoiding them, you will be able to write more robust applications, more secure applications, more maintainable applications, and with all these costly effective applications in general. So that's the real purpose why I want you to see these tips, these 10 tips, and what you will gain by understanding these 10 tips I'm presenting you now. So beans, define as beans only the objects that need to be defined as beans. I'm going into my IntelliJ and I will create a new application, so a new project. You've seen me, I've just opened my IntelliJ, but I have no project created here. It's only a test project that I have been creating just before the presentation for my own implementations. So now I will be starting by creating a new project together with you, and I will create a Spring Boot project. Spring Boot is one of the most important Spring projects of the Spring ecosystem, and you'll use it a lot. Especially today, we use Spring Boot a lot for implementing applications by making use of the convention of over configuration principle, which means that Spring provides you out of the box a lot of configurations and you need only to change some of them. So it's pretty cool. And one of the things, one of the mistakes I've seen in implementations, so in common applications developed out there by developers, is making beans out of objects that shouldn't be beans at all. So let's call this Spring in Winter 1.1. So this is the first meeting we have, and this is the first project. And you can use the latest version if you wish. It's version 15, but the latest long-term supported version is version 11. So I'm usually in my books using version 11, which is the latest long-term supported. But if you wish to be with the very latest version of Java, you can actually use 15, and you see that Spring Boot and Spring is compatible with the latest version. It's always a framework in development, so it's a very fast developing framework with a very fast and awesome community. And I'm gonna just add the Spring Web dependency here, which enables me the capabilities of creating Spring Web application. And I will press the finish and I will create my project. And the first tip, remember, the first tip we've been discussing is define as beans only objects that need to be defined as beans. So in Spring, we use beans to tell Spring which are the objects we want it to manage. Because how frameworks work in general today in the Java ecosystem, and how Spring works as well, is to have a collection of objects where you add the objects you want the framework to manage, such that the framework can plug in the capabilities it comes with out of the box to those objects. So that's the purpose of the inversion of control container that we also call the Spring context. When you hear the Spring context, when you hear the Spring inversion of control container, they are more or less the same thing. You just you can just think of them as being a place in the memory of your application where you place the object instances that you want Spring to manage. So we have two kinds of objects in our applications. It is the objects we want Spring to manage, and is the objects we don't need Spring to manage. Not that we don't want, we don't need Spring to manage. So if you don't need Spring to manage a specific object, then you don't make it a bin in the context. Why shouldn't you make it a bin in the context in this case? Because making an object a bin in the context, you add some you make your application slower by allowing Spring to actually intercept and manage that object, and you don't want to do that if there is not a real purpose for doing that. So if there is not a real purpose for making your object known by Spring, it's better to just keep it as a normal object. So remember, to create, for example, a bin, you can let's say in a web application, you want to create an endpoint, isn't it? In this case, you just create a controller class. So say we create a package controllers, and inside the controllers package, then you create a class, and this class can be Happy Christmas Controller. So Happy Christmas Controller, it's our REST controller, and in order to be known by Spring, because when you define something in this class, you define something that you want to act as an action for a specific endpoint. That's why we call it a controller. That's why the web application, that's the web application's purpose. When you have a web application, when you define a web application, you want to have endpoints that expose pages, isn't it? So say this is a REST controller that's serving the front end of a web application. You want to write a method such as public string Merry Christmas, and this method returns Merry Christmas. And you want to add an annotation that is, say, get mapping on the method, because this will actually represent the endpoint itself, is the path and the method, the HTTP method and the HTTP path one would use to call these actions and get the result, which is Merry Christmas. But if I would start the application now, I wouldn't see anything, even though I used the proper annotation over my method to make it an endpoint. And why didn't I? What didn't I do? What did I forget to do in this case? Well, I forgot to actually add the REST controller annotation over the class. And well, this is basically making, or let's say adding a bin in the Spring context. So this annotation wouldn't work without me in any possible way make sure that this is a bin in the Spring context, because Spring can manipulate my method here and something inside this class only if we make the object known to Spring. Well, it's a little bit more than this, because you see here we are using REST controller, which is not only a stereotype annotation. The stereotype annotation is hidden inside REST controller and is this controller, but this is a detail that you are not interested for the moment. Just take the whole idea. I make a class, I make a class, add a bin in the Spring context, like in my case here, because I want Spring to do something with that class. But if I have only a model class, and the model classes, they are usually the classes we write to model the data our application uses, like data access objects, like entities that we store in a database. These are only classes with the only purpose, with their only responsibility of modeling how the data looks like. So you don't need more than that from them. You don't need the Spring, you don't need a framework to manage them somehow. So if I have a model class and say I want a response, like a class here, my response for the Merry Christmas will be I don't know, message, and then the message contains a string, say private string message, then does this class need to create a bean in the Spring context? Well, looking at this class, you see it's only defining an attribute and it's only representing the way a message looks like. I can have a controller if I wish that takes the message as a parameter here. And then, for example, I can just use it here and say message, new message of Merry Christmas, my actual message. And then the way it works is that the Spring web application automatically translates this to a REST representation, to a JSON representation in my REST endpoint, of course. But the message class doesn't need anything in terms of Spring and managing it. You don't see any Spring annotation here. If you don't have any capability the class needs to benefit of from Spring, then you don't make it a bean in the context. And I often see people even creating classes that are defined as beans in the context, because you see you can actually make this message a bean in the context easily itself, either by annotating it with an annotation that represents a stereotype annotation, and in this case it will become a Spring in a bean in the Spring context. So you can do that. Or the second way, in which you create a controller's configurations package, and inside the configuration package you have, say, a project config class, and in the project config class, which you define as a configuration class, you define a bean, say public message, and you make it a bean in the context this way, new message of Merry Christmas. And this is working now. So if I want to take this from the context in my controller by injecting it, for example, like this, using AutoWired, then you can return the message directly, which now comes from the Spring context. But let's take a look again on the implementation. You did create an instance and add it as a bean in the Spring context. But did you gain anything by just making it part of the Spring context? The answer is no. You just made the object part of the Spring context. But being that it doesn't make use of any Spring capability inside, then it's for nothing. And you just add some time and decrease the performance of your application like this, because you now have also Spring managing your object, and instead of just creating, say, the instance you needed and then returning the message. You can test the application, it will be working. So we can just, let's start the application and use a browser to call our Christmas endpoint. Say localhost 8080/Christmas. And if my application started, oh, it didn't start yet. We have to wait a little bit because we didn't compile it yet. It's the first time it compiles. But once it started, and you see now the message here says it started, port 8080, and you can go in your browser and check that's working, and you see that we got back the message, Merry Christmas, so it's actually working. But it would have worked the same if you just returned the instance instead of making it a bean in the context. And in terms of performance, it would have been better, because making an object part of the bean context without having it gaining some capabilities from Spring, it doesn't make sense. If you don't have any gain from Spring, if Spring doesn't provide any capability for that object, then the lesson is don't make it a bean in the context.